The routine patrol. Officer Caroline Barnes sat in her patrol car on a breezy afternoon, her eyes scanning the quiet streets of Wellington Estates, a gated community known for its sprawling mansions and perfectly manicured lawns. The neighborhood was the epitome of wealth and exclusivity, and as one of the few officers assigned to this area, Caroline had grown accustomed to its predictable rhythms. But today, something felt different. The department's warnings about a recent spike in burglaries targeting affluent neighborhoods lingered in her mind, sharpening her vigilance. Caroline wasn't new to the job. With nearly a decade of experience, she had seen it all, from petty thefts to life-altering emergencies. However, an incident from her past often shadowed her judgment. A burglary gone wrong in another district had left a family traumatized, and Caroline had taken the brunt of the blame for not acting quickly enough. The memory haunted her, compelling her to act on even the faintest signs of suspicion. This was one of those moments. A sleek black luxury car parked outside a mansion immediately caught her attention. The car didn't belong to any of the residents she recognized, and the Wells family, owners of the mansion, were known to be out of town. Caroline's instincts flared, a mix of professional caution and an underlying sense of unease. Her mind began piecing together scenarios. What if this was the beginning of another burglary? What if her inaction led to yet another preventable crime? Caroline pulled her patrol car to a stop a short distance away, her eyes narrowing as she observed the vehicle. A woman sat inside, engrossed in what appeared to be a phone call. Her features were obscured by the tinted glass, but Caroline could make out her silhouette. "This car doesn't belong here," she muttered under her breath. Her heart quickened, and a familiar wave of tension swept through her body. Picking up her radio, she informed dispatch of her location and intent to investigate. "Just a routine check," she said aloud, as though trying to convince herself that this was merely procedure. Yet deep down, she knew it wasn't just routine. Something about the situation unsettled her. Stepping out of her vehicle, Caroline adjusted her utility belt and approached the luxury car. Her boots crunched against the gravel driveway, a sound that seemed to echo in the stillness. The woman inside finally noticed her presence, her head turning slightly in surprise. Lowering the window, the woman revealed a strikingly composed face. She was a woman of color, dressed in elegant business attire, her demeanor radiating confidence and poise. "Good afternoon, officer." "Is there a problem?" the woman asked, her tone polite yet firm. Caroline hesitated, caught off guard by the woman's self-assurance. "I'll need to see your ID and vehicle registration," she replied, her voice steady but clipped. The woman raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "May I ask why?" Caroline straightened her posture, masking her growing discomfort. "There have been reports of suspicious activity in the area. This is just a routine check." The woman's smirk faded, replaced by a look of exasperation. "Suspicious activity? I'm sitting in my car, officer. What about this is suspicious?" Caroline's grip on her flashlight tightened. She'd expected cooperation, not pushback. The tension in the air thickened as the woman retrieved her identification with deliberate movements, handing it over without breaking eye contact. Caroline's gaze flicked to the name on the ID, Samantha Green. The name didn't ring any bells, but the credentials did. Samantha was a state senator. For a moment, Caroline's resolve wavered. She'd seen Senator Green's name in the news, a fierce advocate for justice and equality, often at the forefront of legislative battles for marginalized communities. The realization hit her like a wave, but instead of diffusing the situation, it heightened her sense of unease. Why would a state senator be parked outside this mansion? "Do you live here?" Caroline asked, her tone probing. Samantha's eyes narrowed. "No, I don't. But I don't see how that's relevant." Caroline's jaw tightened. "It's a simple question, ma'am. Do you have a reason to be here?" Samantha's composure didn't falter. "I'm here for a meeting with the homeowners. They're expecting me." Now, unless you have a valid reason to detain me, I suggest you let me get back to my call. Caroline's mind raced. The situation wasn't adding up, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being too aggressive. Doubts crept in, whispering questions she didn't want to confront. Was she acting out of genuine concern, or was she letting unconscious bias cloud her judgment? Before she could respond, the front door of the mansion opened, and a middle-aged woman stepped out. It was Nancy Wells, the homeowner. Her face lit up with recognition as she spotted Samantha. "Samantha, there you are. I'm so sorry, I got caught up on a call. Please, come in." The tension between Caroline and Samantha hung in the air as the senator turned back to the officer, her expression unreadable. "I believe that clears up any confusion," she said, her tone icy. Caroline's face flushed. "My apologies for the misunderstanding," she muttered, stepping back to let Samantha pass. But as she returned to her patrol car, a nagging voice in her head wouldn't let her off the hook. Had she truly been following protocol, or had she crossed a line? As Samantha disappeared into the mansion, Caroline sat in her car, staring at the empty driveway. The encounter replayed in her mind, each detail more unsettling than the last. She'd avoided a disaster, but the doubts gnawed at her, leaving her questioning not just the events of the day, but the very principles that had guided her career. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice, bias, and her own role in the system. Part 2, Revelations and Reflections. Caroline's shift ended hours later, but the encounter with Samantha Green lingered in her mind like an unfinished sentence. As she drove home, the city lights blurred into streaks, and her thoughts raced in tandem. She'd prided herself on being a fair officer, someone who treated every situation with professionalism and care. But today's events had shaken that belief to its core. Once inside her modest apartment, Caroline collapsed onto her couch and stared at the ceiling. She replayed Samantha's words in her head, "Suspicious activity? I'm sitting in my car, officer. What about this is suspicious?" Caroline had no satisfactory answer. She'd acted on instinct, but whose instincts? Were they hers, shaped by years of training and experience, or had they been influenced by something darker, something she wasn't ready to admit? Unable to shake her unease, Caroline turned to her laptop and began researching Samantha Green. The senator's face filled the screen, her confident smile radiating in every photograph. Article after article praised Samantha's work, highlighting her relentless advocacy for police reform, racial justice, and community-building initiatives. The irony wasn't lost on Caroline. She'd stopped a woman whose life's work was rooted in the very ideals Caroline claimed to uphold. Scrolling further, Caroline came across a headline that stopped her cold: "Senator Green pushes for accountability in law enforcement." The accompanying video showed Samantha addressing a packed courtroom, her voice steady and resolute. "Accountability is not an attack on good officers," she said. "It's a commitment to ensuring that the badge represents integrity and trust." Caroline paused the video and leaned back, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Samantha's words weren't accusatory, they were a challenge, one that forced Caroline to confront uncomfortable truths about her profession and herself. The next morning, Caroline arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. She'd spent the night wrestling with questions that refused to let her rest. She needed answers, not just for herself but for the sake of her integrity as an officer. After logging into her workstation, she pulled up the incident report she'd filed the day before. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she hesitated. What could she possibly write that would justify her actions? Before she could start, her partner, Officer Ethan Miller, walked in, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a look of concern. "Hey, Barnes, you okay? You seemed a little off yesterday," he said, sliding into the chair beside her. Caroline glanced at him. Caroline Barnes had never experienced a moment of such sharp internal conflict in her career. As she stood in front of Samantha Green's luxury vehicle, a whirlwind of doubt and determination churned within her. She was certain she was acting out of protocol, yet the look in Samantha's eyes, calm, piercing, and unyielding, shook her confidence. What had started as a routine patrol had spiraled into something much more significant, though she couldn't fully grasp the weight of it yet. Samantha Green, meanwhile, leaned back in her seat, her demeanor steady, betraying none of the irritation bubbling under the surface. She'd been in situations like this before, and the pattern was always the same. Yet, something about this encounter felt different. The officer standing before her seemed less confident, more conflicted. Samantha wondered whether this was an opportunity to challenge the implicit biases she had spent her career fighting against, or if it was yet another reminder of how deeply rooted they were. The neighborhood was silent, save for the occasional hum of a distant lawnmower and the soft rustling of trees in the wind. The stillness only amplified the tension between the two women. Caroline broke the silence first. "I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the car," Caroline said, her voice firm but lacking its usual authority. Samantha raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Am I being detained, Officer Barnes?" she asked, her tone sharp yet composed. Caroline hesitated. The question caught her off guard, though it shouldn't have. "No, you're not being detained," she admitted, "but I'd feel more comfortable if we continued this conversation outside of the vehicle." "Comfortable," Samantha repeated, her voice dripping with irony. "And my comfort, I assume, is not a concern here." Caroline felt her cheeks flush. "This isn't about comfort," she snapped, her professionalism slipping for a brief moment. "It's about ensuring safety." "Safety," Samantha said, nodding slowly as if considering the word. "Very well, officer. If stepping out of my car will alleviate your concerns, I'll do so." She opened the car door with deliberate calm and stepped out, her posture erect, her movements measured. She was dressed impeccably, her tailored blazer and polished heels a sharp contrast to the dusty pavement beneath her. Caroline's eyes briefly flicked to the gold watch on Samantha's wrist, a subtle reminder of the disparity between them. "Hands where I can see them," Caroline instructed, her voice regaining some of its earlier edge. Samantha complied, raising her hands slightly, though her expression remained one of bemused exasperation. "Now what?" Samantha asked, her tone cool. Caroline's mind raced. What was her next move? She had no probable cause to search the vehicle, no tangible evidence that anything illegal had occurred. Yet, standing down felt like admitting she had overstepped, and she wasn't ready to concede that. "I need to verify your identity," Caroline said, grasping at a procedure that might lend her some semblance of control. Samantha gestured toward her car. "My ID is in my wallet, which you already have. Feel free to examine it as thoroughly as you need." Caroline retrieved the wallet from her patrol car, her hands shaking ever so slightly. The ID confirmed what Samantha had already stated. She was indeed Samantha Green, a state senator. Caroline's stomach sank as she processed the implications. A senator. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a potential career-ending blunder. Caroline returned to Samantha, ID in hand. "Everything checks out," she said tersely. "You're free to go." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "Free to go," she repeated, her tone incredulous. "As if I've been detained." "No, Officer Barnes, I don't think we're done here." Caroline's heart sank further. "I've already explained," she began, but Samantha cut her off. "You've explained nothing," Samantha said sharply. "What you've done is profile me. Let's not dance around it. If I were someone else, someone who looked different, dressed differently, would we be having this conversation? Would you have stopped me in the first place?" Caroline opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. The truth, however uncomfortable, was staring her in the face. "I've spent my career fighting for justice," Samantha continued, her voice rising slightly. "Not just for myself but for countless others who are judged before they're known. And here you are, proving just how far we still have to go." Caroline's defenses crumbled under Samantha's gaze. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the weight of her actions was undeniable. She had acted out of bias, whether she'd intended to or not. "I'm sorry," Caroline said finally, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. "I made an error in judgment." Samantha's expression softened slightly, but her stance remained firm. "An error in judgment is putting it lightly," she said. "Do you understand the gravity of what just happened? Do you realize how easily this could have escalated into something far worse?" Caroline nodded, her eyes downcast. I do." For a moment, there was silence between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Then, Samantha sighed. "I'm not interested in ruining your career, Officer Barnes," she said. "But I do expect accountability. What happened here today needs to be addressed, not swept under the rug." Caroline looked up, her eyes meeting Samantha's. "I understand," she said quietly. "And I'll take responsibility for my actions." Samantha studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Because this isn't just about you or me. It's about changing a system that allows these biases to persist." With that, she turned and walked back to her car, her heels clicking against the pavement. Caroline watched her go, a mixture of shame and determination swirling within her. She knew this encounter would stay with her for a long time, shaping not just her career but her understanding of the world she had sworn to protect. As Samantha's car disappeared down the street, Caroline took a deep breath and returned to her patrol car. There was work to be done, not just on the streets, but within herself. Unveiling truths. The fallout from the neighborhood incident reverberated through Caroline's world in unexpected ways. By the time she returned to the precinct that evening, the whispers had already started. News of the confrontation, fueled by the video the bystander had uploaded, had begun circulating online. The caption read, "Another example of racial profiling," accompanied by a snippet showing Caroline demanding Samantha step out of her car. The video didn't show the context, only the tense moments, which were enough to spark outrage. Caroline sat at her desk, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the stacks of papers she had yet to process. Her hands trembled as she sipped her now lukewarm coffee. Across the room, Officer Ethan Miller approached, his usually affable demeanor replaced with concern. "Hey, Caroline, you okay?" he asked, sliding into the chair opposite her desk. He placed his hands on the table, leaning forward as if to shield their conversation from prying ears. Caroline forced a tight smile. "Just another day at work," she said, her tone clipped. Ethan's brow furrowed. "You know, that video, it's blowing up. The chief's already seen it. It's not looking great." Caroline's grip on her coffee cup tightened. "What was I supposed to do, Ethan?" There were reports of burglaries in the area, and she stopped, realizing how defensive she sounded. The memory of Samantha's piercing gaze and calm demeanor replayed in her mind like a broken record. Ethan nodded slowly. "I get it. But you know how things are now. People are quick to judge, especially with only half the story. The department's talking about bringing her in for a formal statement." "Her?" Caroline asked, confused. "Samantha Green," Ethan clarified. "Apparently, she's a state senator." The words hit Caroline like a punch to the gut. She had suspected Samantha was someone important, but a state senator? Her mind reeled. Everything about the encounter, the confidence, the composure, the refusal to back down, now made sense. The next morning, Caroline was summoned to the chief's office. Chief Reynolds, a seasoned officer with decades of experience, had a reputation for being fair but firm. As Caroline entered the room, she noticed Samantha Green seated across from the chief's desk, her posture regal yet unyielding. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, Samantha exuded an aura of authority that made Caroline's uniform feel like a costume. "Officer Barnes, have a seat," Chief Reynolds said, gesturing to the chair beside Samantha. His tone was neutral, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the situation. Caroline sat down, her pulse quickening. The air in the room was thick with unspoken tension. Samantha turned her head slightly, acknowledging Caroline with a measured glance. "Senator Green has graciously agreed to meet with us to discuss the events that transpired yesterday," Chief Reynolds began. "This is an opportunity to clear the air and address any misunderstandings." Caroline's jaw tightened. Misunderstandings? She wanted to defend herself, to explain her actions, but the chief's tone left little room for argument. Samantha leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on her lap. "Chief Reynolds, I appreciate the gesture. However, I want to make it clear that this isn't about one officer's actions. This is about systemic issues that go far beyond yesterday's incident." Caroline's heart sank. Systemic issues. The phrase carried a weight she wasn't prepared to bear. "Officer Barnes," Samantha said, turning her attention fully to Caroline. Her voice was steady but not unkind. "I don't believe you acted out of malice. But intent doesn't erase impact. What happened yesterday is part of a larger pattern, one that many people like me face every day." Caroline felt a pang of guilt she couldn't ignore. She had joined the force to serve and protect, not to perpetuate harm. Yet here she was, accused of being part of the problem. "Senator Green," Caroline began, her voice faltering slightly. I was just trying to do my job. There had been reports of burglaries, and I thought," she trailed off, realizing how hollow her words sounded. Samantha nodded. "I understand that. But let me ask you this, when you saw me in that car, what made you think I didn't belong there?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Caroline opened her mouth to respond but found no words. She had asked herself the same question repeatedly since the incident, and each time, the answer eluded her. Over the next week, the department launched an internal review. Caroline was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. The public's reaction was swift and polarized. Some rallied behind Samantha, calling for accountability and reform. Others defended Caroline, arguing that she had been doing her job under difficult circumstances. Amid the chaos, Caroline received an unexpected call. Samantha wanted to meet, not at the precinct, but at a local community center she frequented. Reluctantly, Caroline agreed. The community center was bustling with activity when Caroline arrived. Children played in the gymnasium, volunteers handed out meals, and a group of women sorted through donated clothing. Samantha was waiting in a small conference room, a stack of papers in front of her. "Thank you for coming," Samantha said, gesturing for Caroline to sit. Caroline hesitated before taking a seat. "I'm not sure why I'm here," she admitted. Samantha smiled faintly. "I wanted to show you something." She slid the stack of papers across the table. Caroline picked up the top sheet and began reading. It was a report detailing instances of racial profiling in the state, complete with statistics and personal accounts. Each page painted a stark picture of the challenges faced by marginalized communities. "This is why I do what I do," Samantha said. "And this is why yesterday's incident matters. It's not just about you or me. It's about breaking a cycle that's been allowed to persist for far too long." Caroline set the papers down, her mind racing. She had spent years enforcing the law, believing she was on the right side of justice. But now, she couldn't ignore the possibility that she had been blind to the inequities embedded within the system. "What do you want from me?" Caroline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samantha's expression softened. "I want you to see what I see. And I want you to help change it." Caroline looked at Samantha, seeing her not as an adversary but as an ally. For the first time, she felt the weight of her badge in a way she never had before, not as a symbol of authority, but as a responsibility to serve with integrity and compassion. That evening, Caroline sat alone in her apartment, the stack of papers Samantha had given her spread across the table. She read each page meticulously, her perspective shifting with every story. By the time she reached the last page, she knew she couldn't go back to the way things were. Something had to change, starting with her. The next morning, Caroline made a decision. She picked up her phone and dialed Samantha's number. When the senator answered, Caroline's voice was steady and resolute. "I'm ready to listen," she said. Samantha's reply was simple, "Then let's get to work." The turning point. The cool evening breeze swept across the neighborhood as Officer Caroline Barnes sat in her patrol car, her fingers drumming on the steering wheel. She was replaying the events of the past few hours in her mind, the confrontation with Samantha Green, the pointed questions from bystanders, and the lingering doubts that clung to her thoughts like a stubborn shadow. The encounter had unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Samantha's words had pierced through her professional exterior, leaving her grappling with questions about her own motivations and biases. Caroline sighed deeply and glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly 8 p.m., and the streets were quieter now. Most of the neighbors had returned to their homes, and the passerby who had recorded the incident earlier had left after being assured that the situation was under control. Despite the calm exterior, Caroline's mind was anything but. The uneasy feeling from the encounter lingered, gnawing at her sense of duty and fairness. Her radio crackled, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Unit 4, status check," came the dispatcher's voice. Caroline picked up the receiver. "Unit 4, all clear," she responded, her tone steady but lacking its usual confidence. As she placed the receiver back, Caroline's gaze drifted to the folder of documents sitting on the passenger seat. It contained Samantha's identification and other details she had hastily verified earlier. Everything checked out. Samantha Green was not only a state senator but also a well-known advocate for social justice. The realization that she had confronted someone of Samantha's stature added a new layer of complexity to the situation. It wasn't just about protocol anymore, it was about accountability. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen to see a message from her partner, Officer Ethan Miller. "Ethan, hey, you good? That scene earlier was intense. Let me know if you need to talk." Caroline hesitated before typing back a brief reply. "Caroline, thanks. Just thinking things over." She put the phone down and leaned back in her seat, staring out at the darkening sky. The silence of the moment was broken by a knock on her window. Startled, she turned to see Samantha standing there, her expression calm but resolute. Caroline quickly rolled down the window. "Senator Green," Caroline said, surprised. "What brings you back here?" Samantha folded her arms and gave Caroline a measured look. "I thought we should finish our conversation," she said. "Do you have a moment?" Caroline hesitated but then nodded, stepping out of the car. She leaned against the door, trying to maintain a professional demeanor. "What can I do for you?" Samantha's gaze was steady. "I've been thinking about what happened earlier," she began. "About how quickly things escalated and why. And I believe you've been thinking about it too." Caroline felt a pang of defensiveness but pushed it aside. "I was following protocol," she said. "There have been incidents in this neighborhood, and I was doing my job." "Your job," Samantha repeated, her tone neutral but probing. "And part of your job, I assume, involves assessing situations fairly and without prejudice." Caroline opened her mouth to respond but closed it again. Samantha's words struck a nerve. "I'm not here to accuse you," Samantha continued. "But I am here to challenge you, to challenge the way you've been trained to see people like me." Caroline looked away, her jaw tightening. "People like you?" she echoed, her voice tinged with frustration. "I wasn't targeting you because of your race. Weren't you?" Samantha asked softly. "Or were you just more likely to see me as a potential threat because I didn't fit your image of someone who belongs here?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Caroline's instinct was to deny it, to push back, but she couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of her mind, the one that had been questioning her actions ever since the encounter began. "Look," Caroline said finally, her tone softer, "I can't change what happened. But I didn't intend to make you feel targeted." Samantha's expression softened slightly. "I believe you didn't intend to," she said. "But intention isn't the same as impact." Caroline nodded slowly, the weight of Samantha's words sinking in. She had always prided herself on being a fair and diligent officer, but this incident had forced her to confront the blind spots in her approach. "So what do we do now?" Caroline asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Samantha gave her a small, encouraging smile. "We start by having honest conversations," she said. "About the assumptions we carry and the systems that shape those assumptions. And we hold each other accountable." For the first time that evening, Caroline felt a glimmer of clarity. She didn't have all the answers, but she was beginning to understand the questions she needed to ask, of herself, of her training, and of the broader culture she was a part of. As Samantha turned to leave, she paused and looked back at Caroline. "It's not easy to unlearn old habits," she said. "But it's worth it. For all of us." Caroline watched her walk away, her mind racing with thoughts and emotions. She knew this was only the beginning of a much longer journey, one that would require humility, courage, and a willingness to change. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to take that first step. A ripple in the system. The days following the encounter between Officer Caroline Barnes and Senator Samantha Green unfolded with an intensity neither woman could have anticipated. The video recorded by a bystander had gone viral, sparking a wave of public outrage and debate. News outlets picked up the story, painting it as a stark example of racial profiling and systemic bias within law enforcement. Caroline's name was suddenly on everyone's lips, and the once quiet, predictable rhythm of her life was irrevocably altered. For Samantha, the aftermath was equally intense. While she was no stranger to public scrutiny, the incident had thrust her into a new kind of spotlight. Her calm and composed handling of the situation was widely praised, but Samantha's focus was not on accolades. She saw the viral moment as an opportunity to address deeper issues she had spent her career fighting to dismantle. Caroline's crossroads. Caroline sat in her living room, the glow of her laptop casting shadows across her face. She stared at the screen, reading through countless emails and social media comments. Some were supportive, commending her for remaining professional under pressure. Others were harsh, accusing her of being a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing. The department had placed her on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. While the move was standard procedure, it felt like a punishment. For years, Caroline had believed in the integrity of her work. Now, she was grappling with the idea that her actions, however well-intentioned, might have caused harm. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Ethan. "Ethan, town hall meeting tomorrow night. Samantha Green's hosting. Might be worth going." Caroline hesitated. Facing Samantha in a public forum was the last thing she wanted to do. But a part of her, the part that had been wrestling with the questions Samantha had raised, felt compelled to attend. The town hall. The community center was packed. People from all walks of life filled the room, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. At the front of the room, Samantha stood poised behind a podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. Beside her was a panel of speakers, including activists, local leaders, and even a few members of law enforcement. Caroline slipped into the back of the room, hoping to remain unnoticed. She wore plain clothes, blending into the crowd. Her heart raced as she saw the diversity of faces in the room, young and old, black and white, all gathered to address an issue that had been thrust into the community's consciousness. Samantha opened the meeting with a brief recount of the incident, her tone measured and devoid of malice. "This isn't about one officer or one interaction," she said. "It's about the structures and assumptions that lead to these interactions in the first place." The room erupted in applause. Caroline felt a mix of emotions, defensiveness, shame, and an inexplicable sense of hope. She listened as speaker after speaker shared their experiences and insights, each story painting a vivid picture of the systemic issues at play. Finally, the floor was open for questions and comments. A young woman stood up, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life," she said. "And I can't tell you how many times I've been stopped or questioned just for walking home from work. It's exhausting. And it's not just about race, it's about power and who gets to decide who belongs." The room murmured in agreement. Caroline felt the weight of the woman's words, a stark reminder of the broader context in which her actions had taken place. A moment of reckoning. Toward the end of the meeting, Samantha's eyes scanned the room and landed on Caroline. For a moment, their gazes locked. Samantha's expression softened, and she gave a small nod, as if inviting Caroline to speak. Caroline's heart pounded. She wanted to stay silent, to remain invisible. But something inside her stirred, a sense of responsibility she couldn't ignore. Slowly, she stood up, the room turning its attention to her. "I'm Officer Caroline Barnes," she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I was the officer involved in the incident with Senator Green." A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on her, some filled with curiosity, others with skepticism. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," Caroline continued. "Not just to Senator Green, but to anyone who has ever felt targeted or unwelcome because of their race or appearance." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I've spent the past few days reflecting on my actions and the assumptions that led to them. And I realize now that intention isn't enough. It's the impact that matters." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Samantha's expression remained neutral, though there was a glimmer of approval in her eyes. "I'm here tonight because I want to listen and learn," Caroline said. "I want to be part of the change, even if it means confronting uncomfortable truths about myself and the system I'm a part of." The room was silent for a moment, and then a smattering of applause broke out, growing steadily until it filled the space. Caroline felt a surge of emotion, a mix of relief, gratitude, and determination. Building bridges. After the meeting, Caroline found herself face to face with Samantha. The senator extended a hand, her expression warm but serious. "That took courage," Samantha said. "Thank you for speaking up." Caroline shook her hand, the weight of the moment sinking in. "Thank you for giving me the chance," she replied. "I have a lot to learn, but I'm ready to start." Samantha nodded. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "But moments like this? They matter." As Caroline left the community center that night, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, she felt hopeful, not just for herself, but for the community she had sworn to serve and protect. Seeds of change. In the months following the town hall meeting, ripples of change began to spread through the community. The viral video that had initially sparked outrage now served as a call to action. Conversations about bias, accountability, and reform took root in living rooms, workplaces, and schools. For both Caroline Barnes and Samantha Green, the aftermath of their encounter marked the beginning of an unexpected journey, one that would intertwine their paths in ways neither could have foreseen. Caroline's commitment. Caroline's first step was to seek education. She enrolled in workshops and seminars on implicit bias, community policing, and restorative justice. At first, these sessions were uncomfortable. She had to confront truths about systemic racism and her own preconceived notions, truths that challenged the image she had of herself as a fair and objective officer. One workshop, in particular, stayed with her. A facilitator asked participants to share a moment when they had made an assumption about someone based solely on appearance. When Caroline's turn came, she hesitated but then spoke candidly about her encounter with Samantha. "I told myself I was just doing my job," Caroline admitted. "But deep down, I know I made assumptions. And those assumptions led to actions that hurt someone who didn't deserve it. The room was silent as she finished speaking. The facilitator nodded, then said, "Acknowledgement is the first step. The real question is, what will you do next?" That question became Caroline's guiding principle. She started volunteering with community groups focused on bridging the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. She worked with local schools to create programs that introduced students to positive interactions with police officers. And she began advocating for reforms within her own department, pushing for mandatory bias training and the implementation of community oversight panels. Samantha's vision. For Samantha, the incident reaffirmed her commitment to systemic change. She used the momentum from the viral video to introduce a series of legislative proposals aimed at improving accountability and transparency in law enforcement. Her proposals included mandatory body cameras, civilian review boards, and funding for community-based public safety initiatives. But Samantha knew that legislation alone wasn't enough. She needed to build trust, not just with her constituents but also with those who viewed her efforts as adversarial. To that end, she launched a series of town hall meetings and roundtable discussions, inviting police officers, activists, and community members to share their perspectives. One of these meetings took place at a local community center, where Samantha invited Caroline to speak. Despite her nerves, Caroline agreed, seeing it as another opportunity to make amends and contribute to the dialogue. The round table. The room was packed, the atmosphere charged with both anticipation and skepticism. Samantha opened the discussion by recounting the events that had brought them all there, emphasizing the importance of turning a negative experience into a positive force for change. When it was Caroline's turn to speak, she stood up and faced the audience, her heart pounding. "I'm not here to defend my actions," she began. "What I did that day was wrong. But I'm here to listen, to learn, and to be part of the solution." Her words were met with cautious applause. Over the course of the evening, Caroline fielded tough questions from community members, some of whom were still angry and distrustful. But she answered each question honestly, acknowledging the flaws in the system and her own role in perpetuating them. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had shifted. While not everyone was ready to forgive, many attendees expressed a newfound respect for Caroline's willingness to face the consequences of her actions and work toward change. A partnership forms. As Caroline and Samantha continued their respective efforts, they found themselves crossing paths more and more often. What had started as a contentious encounter gradually evolved into a partnership rooted in mutual respect and a shared goal. One day, Samantha invited Caroline to join a task force she was forming to address systemic bias in law enforcement. "We need voices from inside the system," Samantha said. "People who understand how it works and are willing to push for change." Caroline hesitated at first, unsure if she was the right person for the role. But Samantha's confidence in her abilities was contagious. "You've already started the work," Samantha said. "This is just the next step." The task force brought together a diverse group of individuals, including activists, legal experts, and police officers. Their discussions were often heated, but the shared commitment to progress kept them moving forward. Together, they developed a comprehensive set of recommendations for reform, which Samantha presented to the state legislature. A ripple effect. As the months turned into years, the changes initiated by Caroline and Samantha began to bear fruit. The police department implemented many of the task force's recommendations, leading to increased transparency and improved relations with the community. Instances of bias-related complaints decreased, and trust in law enforcement gradually began to rebuild. Caroline's career took a new direction. She became a trainer, teaching new recruits about the importance of cultural competency in ethical policing. Her story, once a source of shame, became a powerful tool for education and change. Samantha's legislative efforts also gained traction. Several of her proposals were signed into law, setting a precedent for other states to follow. She continued to advocate for marginalized communities, her work bolstered by the partnerships she had built along the way. A meeting of minds. One sunny afternoon, Caroline and Samantha met at a local park to celebrate the anniversary of the task force's creation. The event was modest, but its significance was profound. Families, officers, activists, and lawmakers gathered to reflect on how far they had come and to reaffirm their commitment to the work still ahead. As they stood together, watching children play and neighbors mingle, Samantha turned to Caroline with a smile. "If someone had told me a year ago that we'd be here, working together, I wouldn't have believed them." Caroline laughed softly. "Neither would I. But I'm glad we are." Samantha nodded. "Change is slow, but it's possible. We're proof of that." In that moment, the tension and division that had once defined their relationship felt like a distant memory. They weren't just two individuals who had crossed paths under difficult circumstances, they were allies, united by a shared belief in the power of accountability, compassion, and the possibility of a better future. And though their journey was far from over, they knew they were on the right path, together.